One of the things I've had quite a lot of correspondence about this year is the condition of Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries in Belgium and France. And I hope in this special episode of The Old Frontline, we will uncover what the problem is, what the history of that problem might be, and what the War Graves Commission are hoping to do to remedy the problem and are remedying the problem, and what the future might hold in respect of this issue. So I'm really pleased to be joined by John Gedling, who is the Director of Estates for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So welcome, John.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us to talk about this. Now, I mean, quite a lot of our audience are not from Britain or the Commonwealth, so I don't know if you want to say something very briefly about what the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is and what its remit is.
Yeah, sure. So our organisation was founded during the First World War to care for the graves and the war dead, originally of the Great War, and then extended to the Second World War after that. So we are responsible for the care of 1.7 million war dead in about 153 countries. So I'm Director of Estate, so I care for the structures, the buildings and the memorials, and I'm based at our headquarters in the UK. So for me, there's about sort of 2,000 constructed war cemeteries and memorials around the world where there's something constructed there that we care for. So that comes under my responsibility.
And your work with the Commission has extended over quite a few years, I think.
Yeah, so I've been with the Commission for 8 years, so that makes me in Commission terms a relative newbie. Some of my colleagues have done sort of 40, even 50 years in some cases. So an organisation with extraordinary long service of colleagues. But yeah, I mean, my background, I'm a chartered building surveyor, and I've come from caring for historic estates. And most recently, I have served a couple of terms on one of the governance committees for Historic England. So, yeah, sort of dealing with old buildings, structures, memorials, been very much part of my DNA. So, yeah, there's a lot going on at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that I've been involved with over these last few years.
Very much the kind of work that's taken you through the kind of guardianship and maintenance of heritage of all kinds then, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if you think of the First World War cemeteries that many of your listeners will know across the former Western Front, typically you've got brick or stone walls, constructed across the sacrifice, the stone of remembrance, and shelter buildings and entrance buildings of various levels of complexity. And some of these cemeteries are highly complex, and they were designed by some of the foremost architects of the day, the architects of the empire. So these are extraordinary cemeteries and memorials. And if you think about, the complexity of Thiepval, this amazing memorial, with the sort of brick the tunnels that intersecting one another, is absolutely extraordinary. From a practical point of view, they're not always the easiest to look after, because you can imagine they've had 100 years plus exposed to the elements in Northern Europe. It can be really challenging to care for them all. And then after the Second World War, you think sort of internationally, the Far East, Africa, India, there was an awful lot of concrete being used, and that poses other problems as well. So, it's a real privilege to look after all these cemeteries, memorials, and the buildings we're responsible for, but there's a lot of complexity in how to do that, and it keeps us all busy.
I'm sure it does. And going back to that kind of creation of the Commission and the work that it did in the post-war period to make the permanent cemeteries and memorials, I mean, this was a fairly new thing, and particularly involving the horticultural side of it to create this kind of English garden effect. And in that interwar period, I guess they probably faced challenges then in the early days of building something that was essentially new.
Yeah. I'm still staggered by the scale of what was done in those years after the First World War, because if you think they went into these countries that had been absolutely devastated by conflict and constructed some really, really remarkable cemeteries and memorials. So the practicalities of how they did that, I find amazing. But also, I think that design vision and care, because there were four principal architects involved. The great architects are Lutyens, Baker, and Blomfield, and joined by Charles Holden, and then this whole team of assistant architects. And there must have been a great temptation to sort of repeat designs over and over again, the sort of the Lutyens type A, type B, and you really don't get that. Of course, there's certain features you see used again, but these architects really looked at every cemetery differently, and they incorporated the repeating elements of the cross, the sacrifice, the stone of remembrance, the principles that had been established by the War Graves Commission, but they used their skill and imagination to create these really remarkable cemeteries that we see today. So I feel it's kind of incumbent on us to use that same sort of ethos and of care in our work that we do now, and we do new work. We just finished the construction of a new memorial in Cape Town. Fromelles, Pheasants Woods Cemetery in France was sort of 15 or so years ago, and I think we've tried to keep those same principles, updated to the day, obviously, about construction techniques and skills, but very much from the early days of the commission, there was this sense of quality and care, and that really runs through the organisation now. And I guess that comes back to the comment I was making about colleagues who've been with the organisation so long. There is a real connection to the work that we do.
It's not just a job. I think for people who work for the commission, it's much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also you come across people, particularly our gardeners and stonemasons, where you'll find their father worked for the commission and their grandfather did as well. So it's not just their own length of service. There's a sort of a family link that's gone back, sort of 60, 70 years, which is really remarkable. And there's an awful lot of knowledge as well, which is great. So even here at our headquarters, I'm surrounded by colleagues who've been with the organisation for 20, 30 years. So there's a lot of kind of expert knowledge of our cemeteries and how we care for them, and that really helps guide our work today.
That's brilliant. A big knowledge base to draw on. And in terms of this kind of current issue, if I go back to when I first visited the battlefields in 1979 in the case of Normandy and 82 in the case of Flanders to Ypres, the headstones that I kind of remember then were quite white. They were very white in appearance. But if I look at images from the interwar period and even the immediate post-Second World War period, there's a kind of a darker tone to them, because I guess the way that headstones were maintained in those two periods were very different. And chemicals, I think, in that period when I first went, were a big part of how the treatment of headstones, they were a big part of that treatment, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And you if you look at the very early pictures, there's a great photograph in the information centre at Tynecott, actually, and you see the gardener standing there with all these plants above the height of the headstones, and the headstones are quite dark. And interestingly, a colleague sent me a photograph from the 70s that was a still of a video in about 72, I think it was, and you can really see the headstones are much, much darker than they are today. And I think that's exactly it. There just weren't the products available to perhaps keep them all clean. And in the early days, they had brushes. That's all they were doing, brushes or the use of water. And we know that after the Second World War, moving into the 60s and the 70s, chemicals became more common. And that wasn't just chemicals to clean the headstones. We're talking about, herbicides, weed killers. These products became plentiful and they were quite cheap. and they became the kind of go-to method of, looking after war cemeteries. And I guess it produced a certain effect. Naturally, they did their job, but these days I think we are more conscious of the effects of those products. And, particularly biocides, there's been loads of work done about, the sort of pitfalls of the use of biocides. Historic England have done work at, the National Trust and various others about, why it's a good idea to move away from these things. And that's, it's partly for it's partly for the soil health, for the plants, but for the stone itself, it's not always the best answer either. So I think we know now that it's not the best solution, but for decades it was the kind of go-to solution. And I mean, likewise, weed killers and things. I think there's a lot of people are trying to get away from using those for it. It sort of does the job, but you've got a legacy of you've just put all those products into the soil.
And I think that those of us that have been going for a long time will have had that perception of white headstones. So when changes, I guess, were made within the Commission, following on from advice and perhaps a change in the law in certain countries in the use of chemicals and pesticides, then people began to see a bit of a change, didn't they? Which people started to note on social media, probably just prior to COVID. So I guess that's the time in which these changes began to come in.
Well, I think, I'd say first of all that we've probably not been the greatest at communicating some of this, and we could have done that much better, explaining about why we're doing different things, but also I think really making the point more clearly that the long-term care is really important to us, and that's a fundamental thing about our organisation and won't change. I think the switch away from biocides is not new, because in the Netherlands, actually, we haven't been using chemical biocides for about 10 years. In France, in Belgium, particularly in Flanders, there was a change made about 5 or 6 years ago, and there were two reasons really. One being we knew ourselves that we wanted to get away from using chemical biocides for reasons of the soil health and the long-term, effect on the stone itself. But also the legislation was changing, and we could see that. And actually, those biocides that we've been used to using, we can't use anyway in Flanders because the law says we can't. And we're seeing that happening right across the EU. The Netherlands, we couldn't go back to using the biocides. There's great swathes of France around Paris where you can't go and use the biocides. So, yeah, the change is coming via sort of legislation and the wider practice, but we also wanted to be sort of ahead of that. And as I say, we perhaps could have been better at maybe communicating some of that more openly. But also the fundamental long-term care is still the same. And what I would say is that I think we're more consistent now. I think there has been instances of certain cemeteries getting cleaned and cleaned and cleaned, and others that were less well visited were not cleaned perhaps so well. And what we've really tried to do is to be more consistent. We have a recording system, we have an inspection program. Every cemetery is treated equally, so it doesn't matter if it's really remote and only has a few visitors, or it's right on the Somme and thousands of people go there. It's still treated the same way. The headstones are inspected the same way, and all our teams use the same headstone cleanliness guidance. It's a bit of a sort of epic task because we care for nearly 700,000 headstones across Western Europe. So trying to keep on top of them all, I think, it is quite a huge task, but we can see in the archives it's always been a challenge for the Commission, because I think the first documents we've got from our archives where they were talking about trying to keep the stones clean was about 1932, something like that, where there's communication between the then Imperial War Graves Commission and the experts at Kew Gardens about fungi and staining on stone and how to keep them clean. And there's various things that were done then and subsequently about trying to keep the stone clean. Various preservatives were applied in the 40s and 50s that now you'd look at them and think, oh my goodness, you wouldn't even use those now. But they were all attempts to try to keep the stones clean.
And the cemeteries, they exist in the natural world, don't they? They're part of that landscape. And I think everyone can understand the importance of protecting that landscape, protecting that natural world, and making sure that the cemeteries are a part of it, and would welcome the move away, I would guess, from chemicals, because it's never a positive thing when it comes to wildlife or plant life or just about anything at all. But the move away from it, I guess, has also now created unforeseen problems, which is, I guess, where we get to the black spot issue, which is something that is a phrase that none of us were using even a year or so ago.
Yeah. And the how clean the headstone should be is so emotive, and you do get lots of views, and I'm sure everyone listening to that will have their own opinion on how clean should the stones be. And interesting, we had a complaint to one of our speakers in the UK just last week to say that we'd gone and cleaned headstones that had some rare lichen on and that we shouldn't have touched them. Up to those who have the view that the stone should be completely clean of all dirt 365 days a year and all the positions in between, and I get that it is really emotive. I guess I would repeat again, the long-term care and the consistent care is really important, and that hasn't changed for us. One of the consequences of reducing the amount of biocide we use is that it contains a chemical bleaching agent, and we know that there's like a sort of algae staining on the stone, embedded into the stone, that the biocide obscured, in effect, or bleached. So by removing that product, you start to see this staining appear. And again, historically in the archives, we can see that this was a concern in the past. So we've almost got an issue back that they had before the use of the biocides. And yeah, it's simply that we're using products now that are effective, but they don't contain bleaching agents. So we have to find other ways of removing that black spot staining. So we know what it is. Removing it's more challenging because it's not just on the surface of the stone, it's embedded into the stone as well. What's quite strange is we have seen quite a lot of it this year, particularly in France, much less of it in Belgium, where they've not been using the biocides for 5 years, as I said earlier. So it's quite odd that there is that difference. I'm not sure we quite know why that is ourselves. But we're working with a few external experts at a couple of universities here in the UK, and the University of Antwerp have been hugely helpful over these past few years with helping us with the different products. The main enzyme-based product that we use, they helped us with the scientific research on that to verify that the manufacturer's claims were what they said they were in terms of limited risk to the soil, etc. So we're continuing to work with them to look at this problem. What can we do to remove this black stain or this black spot in a kind of appropriate way? And we're looking at all different ideas, and I think there's about 12 things we're trying at the moment just to see what they look like. And interesting, just before recording this, I've just come back from Brookwood, our big cemetery in Surrey here in the UK, where we're trying 5 different things. So it'd be really interesting to see how effective they are over the coming weeks.
Because like you said, there's no obvious consistency in it. So this year I've been to cemeteries all over the Western Front, but also some in Normandy, where there's almost no sign of it in Normandy. Now I know many of the headstones were replaced with marble during the 2014 70th anniversary period, but Ranville War Cemetery still got a lot of the original Portland stone headstones in it. No sign of the black spot there. And then I did a tour this year where I went to some of the Second World War cemeteries in the central part of Belgium, where there's absolutely no sign of it there whatsoever. But yet, just down the road, we could cross the border into France, and it suddenly appears you go to a communal cemetery, and the headstones were affected there. So it's puzzling for us as visitors. It's a puzzling kind of conundrum, really, that there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. But I guess what you're saying is that the previous methods have kind of held this back, and it's a problem that's always been there, but it's showing itself more now because it was never really a problem that was solved.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I agree. It's really really odd why it's in some cemeteries and not others. And I did a tour back in the summer with our horticultural manager in France, and we were at some of the cemeteries around Serres, whereas there are lots and lots of cemeteries grouped there, and some cemeteries you walk into and you think, oh my goodness, it's on like, all the headstones, and you go half a mile along the road and it's not there at all. You think, well, that is really odd. So we've been plotting all sorts of external factors that could have caused it to be more prevalent in one cemetery than another. There are certain stone types that seem to be more affected, but oddly, the Netherlands, they've not used biocides at all really for about 10 years, yet some of the cemeteries there have not got any of this staining on whatsoever. I think, well, what's the reason for that? So that's part of the work that we're doing with the I
remember talking to the gardener at Grosbeek War Cemetery. I think kind of felt himself a little bit ahead of the curve in the way that he had an approach to the commemorate or to the maintenance of the cemetery, and he hadn't been using. I remember him saying years ago he'd not been using chemicals. Then he was very proud of that fact, and I don't know how long that is, but it's certainly that's a cemetery where I've never seen any kind of example of this problem at all.
And absolutely. And he is a great advocate, that the head gardener there, for reduced chemical use, more natural ways of caring for cemeteries, wildflowers, and an absolutely fantastic looking cemetery. I think it shows that there are different approaches, and we just need to get on top of why it's in some cemeteries more than others, and a kind of long-term answer. But I think some of the ideas we're trying now I think are really promising, really interesting.
And I've noticed over the last month of visiting that there's definite changes kind of taking place, and I think even some of the most severe critics online have posted photographs of cemeteries that they went to 6 months ago where it was quite evident that there was an issue, and now that there's been a degree of cleaning or a method tried, and there's obvious changes, which I think everyone would welcome. But it's an ongoing process, I guess.
Yeah, it is, and this is the time of year, these few weeks where, traditionally we do the kind of the big headstone clean before the winter sets in, where a lot of the products is harder for them to be effective. So this time of year an awful lot happens. It is an ongoing process. I think we'll continue to try to understand where we've got the black staining and where we can do particular things in those cemeteries. The long-term trend is away from biocides. Frankly, whether we like it or not, that's the way things are going. So we want to be ahead of the curve and find suitable alternatives. It's very much ongoing, but I was at Spanbroek Cemetery in Belgium about 3 weeks ago, where we have just done. I mean, that was one of the cemeteries where there was criticism about the condition. I think rightly so. We hadn't got that right, but the team there have just done treatment with lime wash, and they're also using an alternative enzyme product and a couple of other things as well. And the expert at the University of Antwerp was actually using that cemetery to test independently how effective all of these different things are. So it'd be really interesting to see whether any of those are viable, or as I suspect, there might be different things we need to do in different places.
Yeah, and I kind of think one of the things that you did with the webinar that you had and the information that you're putting online, communicating this to people, I think is really, really important, because the Commission is kind of a government organisation, but it's one that I think most people would feel very differently about, because they feel invested in it in terms of what its purpose is, to commemorate the nations and the wider Commonwealth dead from 2 world wars. And many of those people who feel invested in that way often have their own relatives in the care of the Commission. So I think this is why, perhaps passions rise quite high at times, because people have a high regard for the Commission and a high regard for its work.
And look, point taken. And I think you're absolutely right that communication is important, and that is what we've lacked in the past. And when this issue with the black staining came to light, we tried to deal with it internally, and perhaps we should have just been more open then about, look, this is the challenge. I think since the webinar in September, we've continued to do posts with updates. There's a quite recent video that's just gone on with one of my colleagues in Wimpira in Belgium talking about this issue, and there's a couple more things that we're going to do like that. So it's not just people like me talking about it. It's some of our team out in France and Belgium, who've been with us a long time, talking about the challenge and what they're doing. So yeah, absolutely, we need to do more of that, and we should have done it sooner. I completely get that point.
But I think it's welcome, and I think because people they just kind of feel that these are so important, these sites, and that important beyond the history of their own family. It kind of defines everything that Britain and the Commonwealth was, in a century of history and more, and they still have such relevance. And I think it's a positive kind of connection that people have, and they feel positively about the Commission, and it's good to make sure that remains harnessed.
Yeah, and the long-term care is so important to us, and I think one of the hardest things for a lot of colleagues to hear is the sort of suggestion that they don't care because they are so invested. There is such length of service and what have you. So this is really important to get right. I would say is it if anyone who visits the cemetery feels that we have not got it right, they can send the message to our enquiries or via the website. Photos are always really helpful, which cemetery it was, which date, photos if possible, and I absolutely promise that we will look into it and we will get our teams to investigate. And if we've dropped, we haven't got the standard right, and I accept that is the case, sometimes we just haven't got it right. If the messages come in, details of where it is, what the problem was, we will investigate. Our teams will go and have a look. We'll check, and we will, if we haven't met the standards, we will put it right.
And I think that's good, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that part of the Commission's website so that people can kind of click through to it, because you don't want, I've had people email me, for example, and say, can I volunteer to go out and clean some stones? And I don't think that's what you want. What you want is information and knowledge at this point as to where these problems are, and photographs of it, like you say, rather than people going out there to try and do something themselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I think, as I mentioned before, 700,000 headstones across Western Europe. So I think, France alone is something like 858 cemeteries. The scale is huge. We've got about 300 gardeners, and we're often reliant on, individuals making a decision about individual cemeteries. And most cases, people get it right, but either they don't quite get it right, or there's other factors, or we simply missed it. And I get that happens. So we have an inspection cycle. We have people out looking at the cemeteries all the time, but sometimes we just miss things. And so, yeah, we will act. If we've missed it and someone lets us know, we will go and act on it. But yeah, we do very much have our inspection programs to get round all these cemeteries. There is a sort of timing thing, as I was saying, because we know that if we haven't got it right by kind of end of November time, it's really difficult to put it right over the winter. We're then reliant on going and steam cleaning cemeteries, which is far from ideal. With the trying to get equipment to do that is pretty last resort. We will where we have to, but that is not the ideal. So it's trying to make the judgment call in the sort of October, November time of what needs cleaning ready for the winter ahead, and then we do it again in the spring, and then there's an ongoing thing. So our gardeners in France are now using an app, so they record what they've done in a cemetery as part of their visit. So they're looking at headstones as part of that, so we can be a bit more consistent and make sure the cycle has picked up all the work required at the right time.
And I guess as we're coming towards the winter, as you say, you've done remedial work in preparation for the winter, but I guess people who perhaps only casually visit the battlefields, what they perhaps need to understand is that the winters in these places can be very severe, and this is essentially a soft stone standing in the open in an exposed landscape. There will always be problems, and if we're going to renegotiate how as humans we live alongside the natural world, that's got to be kind of part of our understanding that not everything can be pristine every single day of the year, that the weather conditions will always affect what we see on that landscape when we visit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the duty of care is there, and that's paramount. But we've got to be sort of practical as well. And I think aside from the number of graves and the headstones that I mentioned, I think Fabian Ware, our founder, I think he referenced something like 50 miles of wall that was constructed after the First World War, and I think that might even have been an underestimation, actually. So the amount of construction across these cemeteries, even aside from the graves, is huge. And the appropriate standard of cleanliness, as I said earlier, is really emotive. To have every piece of stone free from all dirt 365 days a year in Northern Europe, the only way you could ever do that is copious amounts of chemical. And we know that wasn't done historically. They couldn't possibly do it historically. They didn't have the chemical. You probably can't, or you definitely can't do that now as well without lots and lots of quite harsh chemicals. And that's not appropriate for graves of the war dead, really. So longer term, I think, well, I'm sure it's absolutely beholden on us as an organisation to look after these cemeteries in the most responsible way that we can, and that means using the least harmful products and processes while maintaining that standard of care. And it's where you draw that line is very emotive. But I think it's also really important that we are consistent. That's really important to me, because I hate any of this thought that, well, you should concentrate on, Tyne Cot because it's so large, and the big cemeteries are the Somme that get the visitors. Yeah, of course we should, but equally we should be focusing on a small cemetery, far away from northern France that gets a handful of visitors, because those commemorated there are commemorated equally. So it's also being consistent across the whole of Northern Europe.
And that idea of uniformity in death, equality in death, is something that's at the very heart of the Commission's principles.
Yeah, absolutely. So the number of visitors doesn't come into it for us, and we spend an awful lot of time repairing cemeteries and memorials where we know they have a small number of visitors, and getting more visitors would be great, and there's work to be done on that for sure. But actually the decision about where we prioritise the maintenance, the project work, which is always a balance across such a huge global estate, the number of visitors that a cemetery or the memorial receives doesn't come into it. So everyone is treated equally.
Well, I thank you, John, for taking the time to explain this to us, because it has prompted a lot of kind of emails to the podcast about this, and I think that people they just want to know, and I think that the way you've explained it and the wider issues here and the way the Commission have continued to engage, and I presume that's going to continue as we go forward, I think is definitely the kind of the way forward for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, I'm really glad to talk about it actually, because it's a really important issue, and I think yes, we need to be more open about the things that we're doing, but I'm really excited about some of the ideas that we're trying, because I think it may well show us a way forward. And as I say, I just came back from Brookwood, where we've got all sorts of things we're doing. I can see they're beginning to make a difference already. So I'm now thinking, well, if you can scale these up, then fantastic, because they're much less harmful than those chemicals we've been using. They are producing a really good standard of clean. We have to absolutely reassure ourselves that they work, they're right for the soil. We have independent experts who help us with that. But that could show us a real way forward for the black spot issue, certainly. So I think we will get there. I would encourage again people just to let us know via the inquiries email or on the website if there are issues, if there's concerns, or even if they're not sure, we can look into it, and then we can make sure we're dealing with the issue.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us here today. And we'll put links to the Commonwealth Wildlife Commission in the show notes for this episode. I don't know if there's anything you want to say just before we finish up.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. We will do much more on the website, so we'll encourage your listeners to follow that and to see some other content that we're putting up there. And we will keep doing that, and then we will do another webinar in January. We're hoping to bring on one of our external experts, either as part of that or as a subsequent one, to talk a bit more about exactly what the problem is and the next step. So lots more to come.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Thanks for taking the time today.
Great. Thank you.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.